Today, I want to look into precarious labor market trajectories of migrant women compared to natives and how they generate path dependencies in a commodified policy context, which is still to some extent the case in Belgium. And as Anna already mentioned, I will go into or focus on a number of things that we've done with probabilistic modeling of employment positions. This is not work by myself or completely by myself by any stretch of the imagination. Much of this has been done with Julie Maas, Jonas Wood, also Tine Kill, whom I forgot to mention here on the first slide. Okay, I'm trying to make, yes. So the basic starting point is that individuals with a migration background typically exhibit a weaker labor market situation in Belgium, as is the context in most European countries. That is results, among other things, from segmented labor market integration, which is more strongly the case among the first generation non-European origin groups. And these women are typically overrepresented in lower labor market segments. There is a large body of literature on migrants' labor market outcomes, also published by international organizations, but much of that is cross-sectional work looking at labor market positions of migrant women at any point in time, and there is not that much longitudinal research on migrant women's family trajectories and labor market trajectories available, and yet we think that that is highly useful to actually understand the mechanisms driving these trajectories and understanding how path dependencies accumulate over the life course. So that is pretty much what today's presentation is going to be about. First, I'm going to present some of the work that we've already did. So I will look into women's labor market trajectories after graduation. Then I will look into women's labor market trajectories around motherhood, then differential access to family policies, and also how these labor market trajectories give rise to differential social protection in old age. Having done that, basically that sort of sets the scene for a new research project that we're now going to start, which is on the integration, or basically studying trajectories of migrant women in different life domains. So family formation, labor market trajectories, but also activation policies and so on. Okay, so I try to go about things in a slightly different way. Basically, I have one major point to make. This is the point. And then I have a number of corollaries following from that. So the point that I want to make in today's presentation is that differential transition rates between labor market positions generate differential sequences of state occupancies over time. So I guess that most of you or many of you have a demographic background. So basically you could think of labor market trajectories as people moving between different states, for instance, employed and unemployed. And then we have transition probabilities, basically showing how likely persons are moving to move between these states. So the point that I want to make is that differential transition rates give rise to differential sequences. Okay, so the first thing that we studied, or the first thing that I want to look into here, is what women's labor market trajectories look like after graduation. And to study that, we used a panel on migration, integration, and activation for 2005-2016. And basically, this is a panel using longitudinal microdata from the Belgian Social Security registers. And we focus here on women who graduated in Belgium, so left education in Belgium between 2005 and 2016. For those of you who may be familiar with that, basically the panel design is largely based on the Generations in Gender program of the United Nations. And so basically we mimicked that design using Social Security data. Okay, what do I want to look into? The cumulative incidence of entry into employment. And then I also want to look into the probability of leaving a first employment spell. So thinking back of the multi-state representation that I had a moment ago, I want to look into the probabilities of moving between these states. So what we're going to do first is discuss different definitions of what employment is, because obviously you will have different results depending on the duration of the employment spell, whether you make additional conditions or set additional conditions with respect to wages and work intensity. We'll also look into type of employment, type of contract, and wages. And in the analysis, we control for a number of individual level characteristics, educational level and field, the Dutch language skills that women have, previous work experience, and also a number of household characteristics, number of children, presence of a partner, and income of the partner, as well as some characteristics of the parent, because there is intergenerational transfer of human capital, etc., that we also take into account. Okay, this is a first figure based on that work. And this is the cumulative incidence of entering a first employment spell. So this is first employment, but we use different definitions. So if we just look at or if we define being in a first job as having worked for 2 consecutive quarters, so that is between 4 and 6 months, then of course we find that there is a larger or a large share of women entering employment over time. So on the x-axis, I have quarters since the earliest possible graduation moment. If we're a bit more strict and we consider that a first employment should be or should last 4 consecutive quarters, then obviously the cumulative incidence is already a bit lower. And then if we have additional conditions on income and work intensity, then we find that the cumulative incidence of entering a first employment spell with these conditions being met is even lower than in the previous definitions. So here we see that over time, basically 70% of the women enter a first employment spell meeting these conditions within 48 quarters after graduation, whereas the probability, of course, is higher if we have less strict definitions of employment. So here I will be using the last one, the most strict definition, where we have a fairly long employment spell with also minimum wage and work intensity requirements being met. Okay, if we want to look into people moving between employment and unemployment, you have like different ways of doing that. Here on the left-hand side, figure A, you have the conditional probability of entering a first sustainable employment spell. So for people familiar with hazard modeling, that would just be the discrete time hazard of entering this employment spell, meeting these criteria that I just discussed. But here I further differentiated the figure by migrant background and migrant generation. So the highest line here, the full black line, these are Belgian women, and apparently they have the highest probability of entering a sustainable employment spell. The dashed line or the black blocks is the baseline. And then if we look at migrant groups, we see that the Turkish second generation and the Maghreb second generation are here. They typically have probabilities that are below average and certainly below the probabilities of Belgian women of entering employment. And then if we look at intermediate generation, so women who moved to Belgium before the age of 18, then we see that for them, employment probabilities are even lower compared to second generation and Belgian women. Of course, if you integrate that, so if you go from A to B, you just like sort of integrate the hazard, then you get a cumulative incidence. And here we see that for Belgian women, we have like 85 to 90% eventually entering an employment spell with minimum wage and work intensity requirements. But if we look at a second generation, that is considerably lower. And then if you look at the 1.5 generation, so women moving to Belgium as children, there we see that only half of them eventually enter an employment with those characteristics. So there are clear differentials in moving into sustainable employment by migrant background and migrant generation in Belgium. If you look at the type of employment that women end up in, there are also differences in terms of type of employment, type of contract, type of employment. Here we distinguish between white collar, blue collar, self-employment, and unknown. And it is clear that Belgian women largely are employed in white collar jobs. That is also largely the case for second generation Maghreb and Turkish women, although it is somewhat lower than is the case for Belgian women. And it is considerably lower for women who move to Belgium being children. So the 1.5 generation or intermediate generation have a much higher probability of entering a blue collar job. If we look at type of contract, we see that Belgian women have clearly the highest probability of being in a full-time employment. That is less the case for migrant women. Migrant women, on the other hand, have higher probabilities of being in part-time employment or temporary employment compared to Belgian women. Also, if you look at wage quintiles, then we would find that Belgian women, the black bars, are typically overrepresented in the higher wage quintiles, whereas women with a migrant background are overrepresented in the lower wage quintiles. So basically what it amounts to is that migrant women have a lower probability of entering a sustainable employment, but also have different employment characteristics, more employed in blue-collar jobs, more temporary contracts, and lower wages compared to native women. Okay, so that was entering employment. What we also looked at is the probability of leaving employment. And again, we have two figures here. On the left-hand side, we have the conditional probability of exiting employment. So given that you're employed, what is the probability of leaving that job? And there again, we see that there is a strong differentiation between different origin groups. So the full line here below are Belgian women. And then we see that probabilities are typically much higher of leaving employment for migrant women. This is a very important point. So migrant women have a lower probability of entering employment. When they enter, they have a higher probability of leaving employment again. If you look at the right-hand side, there again, you have the cumulative incidence of exiting that first employment spell. And here you see basically how these differences in hazard rates or transition probabilities, how they accumulate over time. So typically Belgian women have a much lower probability of leaving their sustainable jobs, whereas if we look at migrant women, they have much higher probabilities of leaving those jobs again. So this gives rise to a number of important conclusions. First, a number of conclusions on the first job. Migrant origin women, and particularly Turkish and Maghreb origin women and women of the intermediate generation, are less likely to enter a stable employment spell than native women, and are more likely to exit this employment spell after short durations. They're also less likely to enter a white-collar job, a full-term contract, or have a wage that is similar to natives. And this is not included in the presentation, but we ran a number of models controlling for individual household and parental characteristics. These can, to some extent, explain ethnic differentials, but even controlling for all these characteristics, substantial gaps remain. This may be related to a number of factors, like differential social networks that women can use to find jobs, but we also know that there is discrimination in the Belgian labor market that is well documented and that is negatively affecting migrant women. So there are various reasons, but typically it cannot be explained by differential human capital characteristics, differential household composition, or differential parental background. Apart from these sort of substantive outcomes on first jobs, there are also a number of reflections on labor market trajectories. And these are important points to understand how these differential trajectories give rise to differential interaction with family policies, etc. later on. So if you have a lower entrance rate into employment, and you also have a higher exit rate out of employment, then basically that amounts to labor market trajectories being more fragmented for migrant women compared to natives. If you now think of sequence analysis, basically what we can do, if we have the transition rates of moving between these states, we can run a simulation and generate sequences that migrant women and native women could experience in terms of labor market trajectories, given these transition rates between these employment states. So if you think sequence analysis, then basically what this will amount to is that migrant women will have labor market trajectories with more spells, that they will have shorter employment spells on average and longer unemployment spells on average compared to native women. And there are a number of additional points which are very important if we want to understand the impact of life course events such as parenthood on labor market trajectories, and if we want to compare the effect of such events across groups. The first point is here. Consider women that are employed at some time t. So imagine that I compare a native woman who is employed and compare that to a woman with a migrant background who is equally employed at some random arbitrary moment in time. Well, given that trajectories of native women are much more stable than those of migrant women, we can expect that the probability of dropping out of employment by some later time t plus delta t will be higher for migrant women than natives, even in the absence of specific life course events. So even if I follow women who do nothing special in terms of family formation, do not become mothers or anything, I just follow women over time, then basically the differential stability of labor market trajectories will create the fact that native women who are employed at one point in time have a higher probability of also being employed at some later point in time compared to migrant women who have much less stable trajectories. Migrant women employed at one moment in time have a much higher probability of no longer being employed at some future point. The same holds the other way around. If you look at employed women at some time t, then the probability of entering employment by some later time t plus delta t will typically be higher for native women compared to migrant women, all else equal. So again, if I follow them over time, the differential stability of trajectories will make that women who are unemployed at one moment in time, that the natives have a higher probability of entering employment compared to migrant women. And an important point is what it says here below. The differential employment stability is something that has to be taken into account when comparing the effect of life course events such as parenthood on employment trajectories and comparing these effects between migrant and native women. So I've tried to make the point easier to follow. Maybe it is easy to follow, and then this is redundant, but I'm showing it nevertheless. If you imagine two labor market outcomes, employed on the one hand and unemployed and inactive on the other, then a typical trajectory for native women will or could look like this. A lot of time is spent in employment. Changes in labor market positions are relatively few, and the time that is spent in unemployment is fairly limited compared to the time spent in employment. If we look at migrant women, we find that spells are, or the spells are higher in number compared to the sequence or trajectory of native women. The time spent in employment is shorter compared to native women. The time spent in unemployment here below is much higher compared to native women. And also the balance between the two is different in the sense that migrant women spend more time in unemployment compared to employment compared to native women. Okay, how is this important? So this differential stability of trajectories seems to be key for a number of subsequent outcomes. A first consequence of that is that if we compare the impact of life course events such as parenthood on employment, that it is vital to control for differential stability of employment trajectories. So we did that, and we looked at what the impact of motherhood is on migrant and native women's employment trajectories. So here we use the different panel, Belgian Administrative Socio-Demographic Panel for 1999-2010, which is again a panel composed of longitudinal microdata from the Belgian Social Security registers. Here we focus on women who had a first child between 2001 and 2010, and we compare or we distinguish native women, second generation Southern European women, and second generation Turkish and Moroccan women. We used fixed effects models looking at women's working hours from 1 year before until 3 years after the birth of their first child. Again, the full details on the modeling can be found in the paper. Okay, here you find some results of that work. And here we looked at women who are employed 1 year before the birth of their first child. So here I consider 3 groups. The black group are natives, the green group are Southern European women, and the red group are second generation non-EU women. So here we start 4 quarters before the birth of the first child. So 0 is birth. And what we see, these are changes in working hours. What we see is that among all groups, working hours decline in the quarters preceding the first birth and reach a low during the quarter when women have their first child. What we see subsequently is that as the child is growing older, but these are still young children because we're looking at quarters, we find that work intensities or working hours recover to a large extent among Belgian women, that these are lower among Southern European women, and even much lower among non-EU women. So this figure would seem to suggest that having a child has an impact on working hours, but that having a child also has a differential impact on working hours on native women's trajectories compared to Southern European women and non-European women. If you look at the right-hand side, and here we look at women who were not employed 1 year before the birth of their first child, so here we start with working hours being 0, we find that native women have a higher probability of increasing or entering employment. This drops back again in the quarter when the child is born, and then after that increases again. If we look at Southern European women, we see that the entry into the labor market is not as articulate as is the case for Belgian women, and that, again, it is even lower for non-EU women. Okay, so here we look at, or we stratify the analysis by looking at women who are in different labor market positions 1 year before having their first child. But of course, these patterns may reflect differential employment stability that is not yet taken into account. So the next step is that we basically look at pre-birth labor market attachment among women that is not affected by the position that women have at one arbitrary moment in time. So the idea is that the frequency of moving between these states is higher among migrant women compared to native women. So what we did is estimate the employment probability, or the probability of being employed for migrant and native women, and use that in the analysis rather than observed employment positions at any one point in time. So again, in the paper, you will find how these probabilities were estimated. Basically, probabilities or employment probabilities are a function of age, educational level, origin group, generation, region, household compositions. And then, of course, we allow a lot of interactions between these different characteristics to acknowledge that labor market opportunities are simply different for migrant women than they are for natives. And then we do the same analysis again, but now we stratify women, or we distinguish 3 groups of women based on their probability of being employed 1 year before the birth of their first child. And then we look at women with low pre-birth employment rates. So these are basically women with limited employment probabilities or limited labor market prospects. Then we have a group of women with medium pre-birth employment rates, and then we have a group of women with high pre-birth employment rates. These are typically women having very good labor market prospects. So here you have the three groups, low, medium, and high. And if you compare the different patterns, you again see the similar pattern emerging. So probabilities of working hours are highest in the quarters before birth, then reach a maximum in the quarter where the child is born, and then recover subsequently. But compared to the situation where we considered the observed employment statuses 1 year before having a child, we basically find that the differences between native and migrant women are now largely accounted for. The point is that migrant women are much more in this trajectory, whereas Belgian women are overrepresented in this pattern, given that they have different labor market opportunities. But if you control for differential access to the labor market, then basically migrant women behave pretty much the same as native women. So clearly, taking into account employment stability and differential employment stability between native and migrant women is important when comparing the effect of parenthood on employment trajectories. You basically have to take into account that migrant women will move between labor market positions more frequently than native women. And if you don't take that into account, you may very rapidly draw the conclusion that having a child will have a larger impact on labor market trajectories of migrant women, which does not seem to be the case when properly accounted for. So stratification on observed pre-birth labor market position actually confounds this differential stability of trajectories with the effect of parenthood on women's employment. But if we use employment rates or the probability of having a job, then we only find limited differentials between trajectories of native and second generation women. Of course, this creates strong path dependencies in employment trajectories around parenthood, but basically these differential patterns can be accounted for by the fact that migrant women already have lower pre-birth labor market attachment and basically poorer prospects in the labor market than native women. Okay, second consequence of these differential stability of spells. Basically, the differential intrinsic stability of employment trajectories generates differential eligibility for work-family policies in welfare states that are still strongly commodified. Okay, here we need to say two words about Belgian work-family policies, which are still commodified to a large extent. And I will look into two family policies, the first one being parental leave. And the situation in Belgium there is that if you apply for parental leave, that you need to have worked 12 months with the same employer in the 15 months preceding the application. So clearly, women with stable labor market trajectories have an advantage in acquiring or getting parental leave compared to women who have very unstable labor market trajectories. So differential employment stability may simply affect the eligibility for uptake. Also, with respect to childcare, there is a difference. Childcare agency must guarantee minimal occupancy rates in Belgium, so they need to have a set number of children in childcare permanently throughout the year, and that will create an incentive for childcare agencies to prefer parents with stable labor market trajectories and predictable demands for childcare. Although there is a guaranteed availability for a minimum number of childcare places for minority groups. But also with respect to childcare, lower employment probabilities may affect access to childcare and create differential access to childcare for migrant and native women. So basically what you have is that even after leaving school, employment probabilities are different. This will have an effect on employment trajectories around parenthood, but these differential trajectories will also shape the opportunity that women have or the agency that women have to make use of parental leave policies or to actually use childcare. Okay, I'm going to look into parental leave first. And here the aim was fairly simple, to compare differential uptake of parental leave and then consider 3 situations, make a comparison among all women, then make a comparison that is more restricted by actually looking at women who meet the eligibility criteria, and then third, looking at eligible women that were actually employed before having a first child. Again, we're using a panel that is based on Belgian Social Security registers. We look at women legally residing in Belgium who had a first child between 2004 and 2010, and we distinguish a number of origin groups: Belgian women, neighboring countries, other European countries, Turkish and Moroccan women, which are a fairly sizable group in Belgium, and then other European women. Okay, so here you see the different analyses, 1, 2, 3, and this is basically parental leave uptake in percent. The black bar are Belgian women, and so if we consider all mothers, we find that uptake of parental leave is higher among Belgian women, 40%, and lower in other groups, at best 30%, but in some groups, parental leave uptake is very low, even below 10%. So clearly there are large migrant-native differentials in the use of parental leave. How does that come about? That question is answered by looking at mothers who are actually eligible. If we look at women who actually meet the eligibility criteria and who actually could use parental leave, we find that the differences between native and migrant mothers already become substantially smaller than was the case when we considered all women. So basically, the differential eligibility of migrant women compared to natives is an important factor in explaining the differential uptake of these policies. If we make the situation even more specific and look at mothers that were actually still working when they had a first child, then we see that basically the differences between native women, Belgian women, and second generation women have virtually completely disappeared. So here the idea is, or the result is, that these trajectories, employment trajectories of migrant women are less stable. But of course, if your trajectory is less stable, then you're less likely to meet the eligibility criteria that you need to have worked for 12 months with the same employer in the preceding 15 months. Okay, then childcare, similar story. Here, what we want to do is, again, compare uptake of childcare and compare that between migrant women and natives, controlling for a number of characteristics. So controlling for socio-demographic characteristics, maternal employment probabilities, probabilities of full-time employment and flexible work, local childcare availability at the municipality level, and presence of maternal kin. Maternal kin is important because that is a source of informal childcare that could also account for differential use of formal childcare between migrant and native women. Here we use a different data source. We use the Belgian censuses of 2001, which has been linked to the census of 91, which allows us to construct kin networks. So this allows us to identify where grandparents are living, and that was completed with contextual data on local childcare availability. We look at women having one child at the time of the 2001 census, and we compare uptake between groups. And here again, we cannot make use of the observed labor market positions at the time of the census, because whether you are working at that time may of course be the consequence of you having access to childcare. If you don't find a slot in childcare, you may have to stop working to take care of children yourself, whereas if you do have access, then you may also continue working. So the observed labor market position is endogenous, and to solve that problem, we use estimated employment probabilities to control for differential labor market opportunities of migrant and native women. Okay, here you have the deviations from the grand mean informal child care use. Here you have Belgian women on the left-hand side, and so we compare different models controlling for the different control factors. Typically, we see that Belgian women have above average use of formal childcare, whereas a number of other groups, Southern European women here, and Moroccan women and Turkish women have considerably lower uptake of formal childcare compared to Belgian women. What is interesting here are the dots. So model 4 is, no, that is already including maternal kin. I need model 2 that is controlling for the employment probabilities. So here, if you look at model 1, for instance, for Moroccan women, this is the uptake. It's 15% below average. But if I control for differential labor market opportunities of Moroccan women, then basically the deviation from the mean can be accounted for, and that also holds for second generation. So if you look at the second bar compared to the black square for most groups, you would find that controlling for differential labor market opportunities of these women partially accounts for the fact that they make less use of childcare than native women. Also, the overrepresentation of native women is to some extent accounted for by the fact that they have more favorable labor market opportunities. So this differential stability of labor market trajectories also has corollaries for use of family policies. If we look at parental leave, we actually do find that differential stability of employment trajectories implies differential eligibility that can largely account for migrant-native gaps in uptake. And also for childcare, we see that there is a preference for women with stable labor market trajectories for the simple reason that they have a predictable demand in terms of childcare. And here as well, we find that differential labor market opportunities account for the lower uptake of formal childcare in some migrant groups and generations. So differential employment trajectories and differential stability of employment trajectories also has an implication on how these women are capable of using family policies to combine work and family. Corollary 3. The differential intrinsic stability of employment trajectories between native and migrant women also generates differential pension protection at older ages. So here again, a bit of context. Pension protection in Belgium is a direct function of the sequence of labor market trajectories that individuals accumulate over the life course. So in contrast to some other countries, it's not like a fixed or flat rate benefit that you get. There is actually something as the pension register that will keep track of your employment trajectory and your wages throughout your life course, and your pension is a direct function of that. So what we did here is document migrant-native differentials in the buildup of pension rights. But again, we looked at the period around parenthood to see whether these differential trajectories of labor force participation translate into differential pension protection between native and migrant women. So here we used retrospective data from the Belgian pension registers to document variation in pension buildup from 2 years before the birth of a first child until 10 years after the birth of a first child. And again, we distinguish Belgian women versus women from Central and Eastern European origin, Western European origin, Southern European origin, Maghreb and Turkish women, and for all of these women with a non-Belgian background, we distinguish between first and second generation. In the paper that I will send to Anna, you have the detailed results for both first and second generation, but here for the presentation, I just singled out the second generation and compared them to Belgians. Right, if we have a look at the legend first, this is the way or the different ways that you can build up pension rights in Belgium. So the wide bars are full-time pension rights that are accumulated through work. The light gray are part-time pension rights that are again accumulated through work. Then the somewhat darker gray is are assimilated full-time pension rights, and this is important. Assimilated means that you're not working, but in the calculation of pension rights, that period of time is considered as if you were working. So a typical example would be parental leave that is considered as equivalent to working in the calculation of pension rights. And then the darkest gray, or the black, should you want, is the situation where women have no individual pension rights, but only potentially derived pension rights. So basically, as a result of being married to a husband in most cases who has an individual pension right. Okay, here we again have women's buildup of pension rights around childhood. And we start out with Belgian women, and now we're looking in terms of years. And the third bar in every case, CH, is the moment when the child is born, or when a first child is born. And then we see basically how the pension, the buildup of pension rights in the year where a child is born and subsequent years differs from the years before. So if you look at Belgian women, you find that basically most of the women have pension or build up pension rights full-time through work. Part-time work is less common, and assimilated pension rights are also fairly uncommon before having children. If you look at the year where the child is born, then these assimilated rights become more important, because women are, of course, entitled to maternity leave. But what you find is that after the year that a child is born, that basically the buildup of full-time pension rights to work through work never recovers to the level that women had before entering parenthood. We find that these assimilated pension rights are much more important, but that is only a share of the wage that you previously had that is taken into account. So that is less interesting in terms of pension. And that initially these assimilated pension rights are quite important, which reflects uptake of parental leave. But of course, when these parental leave possibilities are completely exhausted, then women will basically continue working part-time, and we see that part-time pension rights become more important after a child has been born. So basically, you have this diagonal line. Initially, you have assimilated pension rights, and then afterwards, part-time becomes more important. If we look at non-native groups, then we find a somewhat different story. Here we see that, for instance, for Central and Eastern European women of the second generation, that even before having children, the buildup of full-time pension rights through work is less prevalent than is the case among native women, and that predominantly after having a child, that levels of full-time pension buildup through work are considerably lower, and that these assimilated pension rights, which give rise to lower pension benefits in the long run, are considerably more prevalent. And basically, this is a pattern that you will find for other groups. Western European women, similar story, lower buildup of pension rights through full-time work, more assimilated pension rights, which includes unemployment and part-time work. Also for Southern European women, assimilated pension rights, for instance, parental leave, but also unemployment, is much more important, which will give rise to lower pension benefits. And the situation is even more articulated if we look at non-European women, Maghreb origin women. There we see that unemployment, parental leave, etc., are responsible for a large part of the buildup of pension rights, which give rise to lower pension benefit entitlements, and that also holds for Turkish women. So conclusion here is that parenthood and family formation affect the pension buildup of both native and migrant women, and that there is an increasing reliance on part-time pension rights, assimilated pension rights, or derived pension rights after entry into parenthood. However, if we compare migrant women to native women, then we'll find that the likelihood of building up pension rights through assimilated periods or relying on potentially derived person rights. So that is the situation where women no longer build up individual entitlements, but rely on entitlements that are built up by household members, for instance, spouse, that is much more prevalent in all origin groups compared to natives. So to make a long story short, we find that if we look at migrant women, they have a lower probability of entering employment. If they do, a higher probability of exiting employment. That gives rise to differential sequences of employment and unemployment over time. And these in turn create differential eligibility for parental leave use, differential eligibility for childcare use, and also translate into differential buildup of individual pension right entitlements over time. Okay, so this is a bunch of work that we've already done. What we intend to do for the next couple of years is basically proceed on what we've been doing to understand how path dependencies, family dynamics, and active labor market programs shape labor market trajectories of first and second generation migrant women. And here we intend to adopt a multi-state life course approach by also taking into account subsequent labor market transitions of women and understanding how biographies in different life domains, family, education, employment, how these different biographies interact and shape path dependencies that differ between origin groups. Okay, so what we've learned from the past is that already from the start of their career, migrant women have less stable labor market trajectories than native women. And we expect that these are basically shaping also the remainder of these women's trajectories. And it is unclear whether and to what extent patterns of segmented labor market integration result from differential initial labor market transitions upon graduation and how disadvantages accumulate over the life course. And of course, as a result of that, knowledge gaps still exist with respect to the recursive interplay and path dependencies between women's biographies in different life domains. And so that is typically what we want to examine next. If you look at a labor market trajectory, so we've looked at women in education entering the labor market, and there, of course, you can distinguish between different labor market outcomes, and then women can make transitions between these labor market outcomes over time until eventually they retire and retreat from the labor market. So basically what we want to do in the project that we're starting out with now is understanding not how sequences change in terms of life events, but actually how transition rates between these labor market outcomes are different before having a child and after having a child, and how that interacts with family policies and generates path dependencies. And an important policy that I've not yet discussed that we will take into account are activation policies or labor active programs that we have in Belgium that precisely have the intention of increasing labor force participation among migrant women.